Appalachian mud was the color of dried blood, and it hadn't stopped raining in 11 days. Wren Calloway pressed her back against the hollow of a water oak, pulling her daughter tight against her chest. Ivy was 4 years old and had stopped crying an hour ago, which terrified Wren more than the crying had. A child who stops crying in the cold isn't soothing herself. She's surrendering. The wool blanket wrapped around them both was soaked through, a useless second skin that held the chill closer rather than keeping it out. Somewhere in the black tangle of trees above the little sandy river, a branch cracked under the weight of the water. It sounded exactly like a rifle shot, and Wren's body responded the same way it had every time she'd heard that sound in the past 3 weeks. A cold, violent lurch of the heart, a desperate scan of the dark. They had been walking since dawn. They had been running since Thomas died. The year was 1869, and the hills of eastern Kentucky had never been kind to people without land or money, but they had been something close to home. Wren had been 22 years old when she married Thomas Calloway, a soft-spoken timber surveyor who had grown up 2 hollows over from her father's farm. He was not a wealthy man, but he was a careful one, and in the 3 years of their marriage, he had been quietly, methodically building something real. He had surveyed a section of old-growth timber on Boyd's Creek, a dense stand of yellow poplar and white oaks that a Louisville railroad company would pay handsomely to harvest. He had the figures in his ledger. He had a buyer in writing. He had a future sketched out in careful pencil lines in the back pages of a brown leather notebook he carried everywhere. What Thomas hadn't accounted for was Silas Creed. Creed was not a man who bought things he wanted. He was a man who waited until the person holding what he wanted became inconvenient, and then he removed the inconvenience. He ran the county's largest timber operation out of Harlan, kept the circuit judge on a quarterly retainer, and had 3 of his own cousins deputized in the town of Beech Fork. When Thomas refused to sign over the Boyd's Creek survey rights for a fraction of their worth, Creed had simply nodded, smiled, and said he respected a man who knew his own mind. Thomas was dead inside of a week. The official account was a logging accident. A cable snapped, a log shifted, and Thomas Calloway was crushed before anyone could reach him. Wren had stood at the inquest and listened to 4 of Creed's own men testify to the exact same version of events in the exact same flat, rehearsed tone. The judge had expressed his condolences. 2 days later, a man in a clean suit arrived at her door with a lien notice claiming Thomas had borrowed against their property to cover a surveying debt. The document had Thomas's signature at the bottom. Wren had looked at that signature for a long time because she knew her husband's handwriting the way she knew her own breathing, and this was not it. She had 1 week to vacate. She took Ivy, the leather notebook, and a single-shot pistol with 4 rounds in it. She left everything else. She had been trying to reach her cousin's homestead in Letcher County, moving along creek beds and game trails to avoid Creed's men, who she knew were behind her, not because of the notebook. They didn't know about the notebook. They were behind her because Silas Creed had told the county that Wren Calloway had stolen a land deed from his office, and there was a warrant with her name on it, and in Harlan County in 1869, a warrant with Creed's blessing behind it was as good as a death sentence. On the 11th day of rain, with Ivy feverish and barely conscious against her chest, Wren's legs simply stopped. She didn't fall. She sat down against the water oak with the deliberateness of a woman making a decision, and she pulled her daughter close, and she listened to the rain on the leaves above her, and thought about the fact that she had no idea where she was, that the creek she had been following had flooded and split into 3 channels she didn't recognize, and that the cold had gotten into her hands so deeply she could no longer feel the pistol in her coat pocket. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the way Ivy had his exact same widow's peak, that little point of dark hair just above the center of her forehead. She was still thinking about it when the dogs stopped. There had been hounds baying somewhere in the hills to the west for the past 2 hours. She had assumed they were running deer. Now the sound cut off so abruptly that the silence felt louder than the rain, and every hair on the back of Wren's neck stood up. Something was moving through the trees to her left, heavy, deliberate steps that weren't bothering to be quiet. Not an animal. Animals move through underbrush with a particular rhythm, a constant rustling negotiation with branches and roots. This was the sound of something that had decided the forest would move for it. Wren got the pistol out of her pocket. Her fingers were so numb she had to look at her hand to confirm she was gripping it. The figure that stepped through the curtain of rain and hanging ivy was enormous. He was dressed in oilskin and canvas, so thoroughly patched and repatched that the original garment was unidentifiable. He carried a long Pennsylvania rifle across his body, not raised, but not down either. The stance of a man who has learned that the world makes its decisions very quickly, and he intends to be ready for them. He was somewhere past 50, with a gray-streaked beard that reached his collarbone and eyes the pale, particular amber of creek water over limestone. He stopped 10 feet from her and took in the scene without any readable expression. The woman against the tree, the child in her arms, the shaking pistol pointed at his chest. He did not raise his hands. He did not speak immediately. He looked at the child the way a man looks at something that requires a decision he has already made, and then he looked back at Wren. "I'm not with Creed," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had not spoken to another person in some time and was being careful about it. "I know his men's dogs. Those weren't his, but his boys are working the ridge north of here, and they'll cross the creek line before morning." Wren kept the pistol up. "Who are you?" "Augustin Farr." He said it the way people say their own names when they've stopped believing anyone will recognize it. "I run a trap line from Boyd's Ridge down to the Little Sandy. I've been watching your fire for 2 nights. "I haven't had a fire." "I know." He said it simply, without elaboration, and somehow that was worse. The acknowledgement that he had been watching even when there was nothing to watch for. "Your girl's sick." "She's fine." Augustin Farr looked at Ivy with that same flat, diagnostic calm. "Her breathing's wrong. You can hear the rattle from here." He paused. "I'm not asking for anything. I have a cabin a mile up the ridge. It's warm, and it's dry, and it's not on any map Creed's people use. You can put the gun down, or you can keep it up. Either way, that child needs to be out of this rain inside the hour." Wren looked at her daughter's face. The fever had put a hectic, dangerous color in her cheeks, and her lips were the wrong shade, too pale at the edges and too pink at the center. The particular look of a child whose body was working too hard to compensate for the cold. Wren lowered the pistol. "If you try anything," she said, "I have 4 rounds." "I know," he said again. "I counted." He didn't offer to carry Ivy. He seemed to understand, without being told, that Wren would not hand her daughter to a stranger, and so he simply turned and broke a trail through the undergrowth ahead of them. Moving low branches aside and finding the solid ground in the muddy hollows by some instinct that came from decades of walking these hills in the dark, Wren followed, holding Ivy close, watching the broad back of a man she did not trust, and was trusting anyway because there was nothing else left. The cabin was built into the side of a limestone bluff, its back wall the rock face itself. From any approach but the narrow game trail they'd come in on, it was nearly invisible. The logs had weathered to the exact gray-brown of the surrounding trees, and the roof was so thickly covered in moss and fallen leaves that it read as a natural formation. Augustin pushed the door open, and the heat hit Wren like a physical thing, a wall of cedar-smoked warmth that made her eyes water. It was a spare place. A stone hearth that took up most of the north wall, a low rope bed in the corner, a work table covered in the organized clutter of a man who was always in the middle of something, stretched pelts, wire, a worn Bible with a cracked spine, 3 tin cups, and a brown glass bottle of something medicinal. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams. The floor was packed earth, swept clean. Augustin went directly to the hearth, built the fire from banked coals with a few efficient motions, and then crossed to a wooden chest and pulled out 2 wool blankets and a dry shirt that would fit Wren like a tent. He set them on the edge of the bed without looking at her. "Get the wet things off her," he said, already moving to the work table. "All of it. Wrap her in a smaller blanket. I'll get a steam going." Wren stripped Ivy's soaked dress and stockings with hands that were beginning to sting as the warmth reached them. 1,000 small fires under the skin. She wrapped her daughter in the blanket and held her close to the hearth, and she watched the enormous silent man across the room hang a cast iron pot over the fire and begin adding water, dried mullein leaf, and something that smelled sharp and piney that she didn't recognize. "What is that?" she asked. "Balsam and wild ginger. Opens the chest. It won't cure her, but it'll give her body some room to work." He didn't look up. "How many days has she had the fever?" 3. But He made a small, neutral sound that told her nothing except that he had filed the information away. He set a second smaller pot to heat and dropped in a piece of dried venison and some withered roots. Within 20 minutes, the cabin smelled of meat and medicine and wood smoke, and Ivy had stopped shivering. Wren sat on the edge of the bed with her daughter in her lap, drinking hot broth from a tin cup Augustin had handed her without ceremony, and she found herself watching him with the exhausted, helpless attention of someone who has been in charge of everything for so long that witnessing competence in another person is almost unbearable in its relief. He moved like a man who had worked alone for years and had arranged his world accordingly, everything within reach, every motion precise, nothing wasted. There was no performance in it. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was just doing what needed doing because it needed doing. "You knew my husband's name," Wren said quietly. "When I told you I was running from Creed, you said you knew his men." Augustin was quiet for a moment, adjusting the pot over the fire. "I knew Thomas Calloway," he said finally. "Not well. He came through Boyd's Creek last spring doing survey work. We spoke twice. He was a decent man. Careful with his words." He paused. "I heard what they said happened to him. It wasn't an accident." "No," Augustin said. "It wasn't." He turned then and looked at her directly for the first time since they'd entered the cabin, and his amber eyes were steady and without pity, which she found she was grateful for. Pity would have undone her. "I know because I found something." He crossed the room to the work table and opened the Bible. Tucked inside the front cover, folded into quarters, was a piece of paper. He brought it to her. Wren unfolded it with careful fingers and felt the air leave her body. It was in Thomas's handwriting, a half-finished letter, the paper stained at one corner with something dark and old. "Wren, if this reaches you, it means what I feared has happened. Creed sent 2 men to the survey site on the 14th. I recognize Dodd Price. He works for Creed's foreman. I have hidden the full survey record and the buyer's contract where they will not think to look. The proof of what Boyd's Creek is worth is inside the..." The sentence broke off in a slanted, unfinished line, as if the pen had been pulled sideways. Wren's hands were shaking. "Where did you find this?" "On the trail below the survey site," Augustin said. "Half buried in leaves. I've had it 3 months. I didn't know how to reach you, and I didn't know if Creed's people were watching your property." He paused. "I was coming down to Beech Fork to find you when the warrant news reached me. By then, you were already gone." Wren read the letter again. "The proof is inside the..." "He didn't finish it," she said. The frustration in her voice broke on the last word in a way she hadn't intended. Augustin sat down in the single wooden chair across from her, his big hands resting on his knees. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the letter without touching it. "Thomas was a surveyor," he said slowly. "A man who hid things for a living, property lines, mineral deposits, measurements the land office didn't know about yet. He wouldn't hide something in a place that words could describe. If someone found this letter, the location would still be safe." He looked up at her. "What did he carry with him? Every time you saw him working?" Wren thought about Thomas leaving in the mornings. The way he'd check his coat pockets, compass, pencil, ledger. She thought about the ledger she'd grabbed when she fled the house. The brown leather notebook with the pencil lines and the careful figures. She had been carrying it in her coat for 3 weeks. She had not opened it since the day she ran, because opening it felt like speaking to a dead man, and she hadn't been strong enough. She set Ivy gently on the blanket and reached into her coat. The ledger was battered and damp at the corners. She opened it on her lap, turning the pages carefully. Survey figures, measurements, notes in Thomas's compressed, methodical hand. She reached the last page with writing on it, and there was nothing after that but blank pages, and then the back cover. She started to close it. Then she stopped. The back cover was thicker than it should be. She pressed it between her fingers. There was something stiff inside it, not paper, something firmer. She looked at the inner lining of the leather, running her thumb along the edge, and found a place where the glue had been carefully separated and resealed, barely visible unless you were looking for it, and running your thumbnail along the seam. Augustin was already holding his knife out to her, handle first. She sliced the lining open. Inside, protected by the leather on all sides, was a folded document on thick paper, the kind used by land offices and county clerks. She unfolded it on her lap. It was the full survey certificate for Boyd's Creek, notarized and witnessed, with Thomas's figures, the timber assessment, and attached to it with a small brass pin, a signed letter of intent from the Louisville and Nashville Railroad Company, agreeing to purchase the harvest rights for a sum that made Wren's vision blur. $47,000. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered, and then she put her face in her hands and wept. She had not cried since the day of the inquest. She had not been able to afford it. Now, in the warmth of a stranger's cabin, with her daughter breathing easier and the proof of her husband's life's work in her hands, the grief broke through every wall she had built against it and came out of her in long, ragged waves. She didn't try to stop it. She cried for Thomas, and for Ivy, and for the house they would never go back to, and for 3 weeks of walking in the rain with 4 bullets and a dead man's notebook. Augustin Farr stood up, walked to the hearth, and stood there with his back to her, giving her what privacy a one-room cabin allowed. He stirred the pot. He did not speak. He did not offer comfort, which was its own kind of comfort, the acknowledgement that some things do not need to be managed, only witnessed. When she was done, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked up. "I need to get to Frankfort," she said. Her voice was rough but steady. "The state land office, not the county, not anywhere Creed has reach." "I know. It's 4 days on foot, even in good weather. Less on horseback." He turned from the hearth. "I have 2 horses." Wren looked at him. "You'd take me." It was not quite a question. He seemed to understand that she was trying to understand him, trying to locate the motive in what he was offering, because she had learned that men who offered things wanted things in return, and the only question was what. Augustin Farr was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. When he spoke, it was slowly, in the manner of a man who has thought about something for a long time and has given up trying to say it perfectly. "I was a surveyor once," he said. 20 years ago, in the Valley of Virginia, I found a coal seam that a man named Aldous Peck had been hiding from the state assessor for 12 years. I filed my report. Peck had me arrested on a fabricated charge, and I spent 14 months in a county jail while he consolidated the claim. He paused. "When I got out, my wife had remarried. My daughter was calling another man her father. The law that was supposed to protect the record I filed had simply filed it away. No one wanted the trouble of going against Aldous Peck." The fire popped. Ivy stirred in her sleep, made a small sound, and settled. "I came up into these hills because I was done with the world men like Peck and Creed build," Augustin continued. "I told myself I'd stay done with it." He looked at the folded survey certificate on Wren's lap. "But your husband filed a true record. He hit it right, and he died because of it. And there's a little girl asleep over there who is going to grow up knowing either that the truth her father told meant something or that it didn't." He met her eyes. "I'd rather she know it meant something." Wren looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Ivy, at the small rise and fall of her chest, at the widow's peak she'd gotten from a man who had tried, even in the last moment of his life, to protect them. "All right," she said. "We leave at first light." What followed was not easy. Nothing on that road was easy. They rode out before dawn on the second day, waiting for the rain to ease enough to move safely. Augustin rode a big roan gelding and led a smaller bay mare for Wren. Ivy rode bundled in front of her mother, wrapped in the wool blanket and a length of oilskin, and by the end of the first day her fever had broken enough that she was asking questions about the horses, which Wren took as the best possible sign. Creed's men found their trail on the afternoon of the second day. There were 3 of them, riding hard on fresh horses, and they came out of a cut in the ridge above the river road with the confidence of men who had been told the law was behind them. The one in front was tall and pale-eyed, with a deputy's badge pinned to his coat that meant exactly nothing this far from Harlan. He pulled up 20 feet from them and rested his hand on his holster. "Wren Calloway," he said. "You're wanted on a theft charge in Harlan County. Step down off that horse." Wren felt Ivy tighten against her. She put one hand on the pistol in her coat. Augustin moved his horse forward, one slow step, positioning himself between Wren and the 3 men. "She's not in Harlan County," Augustin said. His voice was completely level. "She's in Breathitt County. Your warrant is worth about as much as the paper it's on. Get out of the way, old man." "I'm going to ask you something," Augustin said. And he asked it the way a man asks a question when he already knows the answer and wants the other person to hear themselves give it. Did Silas Creed write that warrant himself, or did he have the judge do it for him? The deputy's jaw tightened. Because if Creed wrote it himself, it's a criminal document, Augustin continued, reaching into his own coat. He pulled out a folded paper, a letter. Wren realized, something he had written at the table the night before while she slept, something he had not mentioned. And this is a sworn affidavit, witnessed and sealed by myself, attesting to the discovery of correspondence indicating that Thomas Calloway's death was not accidental. I have a copy of that affidavit already posted to the Federal Circuit Court in Frankfurt, by way of a rider I paid in the last town we passed through. He let a bead of silence sit. You can arrest this woman and ride back to Creed with her, and when the federal inquiry comes down, your name will be on record as the man who obstructed it, or you can turn your horses around. The three men looked at each other. Wren did not breathe. The pale-eyed deputy looked at Augustin for a long moment, the calculation moving visibly behind his eyes. Then he looked at Wren, and whatever he saw in her face seemed to settle something for him. He turned his horse without a word, and the other two followed, and within a minute the sound of hoofbeats had faded back into the tree line. Wren let out a breath, so long and slow it felt like it had been stored in her bones for 3 weeks. Was that true? She asked. The rider. The federal court. Augustin clicked his tongue and moved his horse forward on the road. Which part worries you more, that it was or that it wasn't? She looked at the side of his weathered face, the absolute steadiness of it. That it was, she said. Because that means you planned this before I even knew I was going with you. He was quiet for a moment. I found Thomas's letter 3 months ago, he said. I had some time to think. They reached Frankfurt on the morning of the 4th day. The State Land Office was a 3-story brick building that smelled of paper and linseed oil and the particular dusty authority of institutions that had been in the same place for a long time. Wren walked in with Ivy on her hip and the survey certificate in her coat and Thomas's ledger under her arm, and she laid everything on the counter in front of a clerk who looked at her trail-worn clothes and her child and her expression, and did not say a single word about any of it. She said, I need to register a timber survey under the name of Thomas Calloway, deceased, with rights transferring to his widow, and I need to do it today. The clerk looked at the documents. He looked at the Louisville and Nashville Railroad letterhead on the signed purchase intent. He looked at Augustin, who had taken up a position near the wall with his arms folded and his amber eyes fixed on the room in general, and said nothing. Let me get the chief registrar, the clerk said. Silas Creed was arrested 8 weeks later by federal marshals. Dodd Price, the man Thomas had named in his unfinished letter, was taken the same morning. Price made a full statement before the week was out. He had spent enough time thinking about it to decide that Silas Creed's goodwill was not worth a hanging charge. The circuit judge's arrangement with Creed became a matter of federal record, and he resigned before they could remove him. The Louisville and Nashville Railroad Company, presented with a valid registered deed and a notarized survey certificate, honored the purchase agreement. Wren Calloway bought land outside Lexington, not a grand estate, a practical place. 40 acres of good bottom land with an old farmhouse that needed work and a barn that didn't. She replanted the kitchen garden herself in the spring, Ivy toddling behind her in the mud, and she put Thomas's ledger on the mantel next to a photograph of him she'd gotten reprinted from the original, and she let herself, slowly and imperfectly, begin to believe that building something again was not a betrayal of what had been lost. Augustin Farr came down from the hills in April. He didn't announce it. He appeared at the farm on a Tuesday morning with his roan gelding and a load of cedar lumber. He said he'd cut and milled himself, and he informed her that the south fence line was inadequate, and the barn roof had 3 bad patches she probably hadn't noticed from the ground. He said it the way he said most things, without particular inflection, as though stating a condition of the physical world. Wren looked at him for a long moment. You could stay and fix them, she said, if you wanted. He looked at the farm. He looked at Ivy, who had come to stand in the doorway behind her mother, and was watching him with Thomas's serious, considering eyes. I expect I could, he said. He stayed. Not right away, not without the kind of slow and honest negotiation that 2 people do when they have both lost things they loved and are trying to figure out what it means to risk anything again. There were months of it. Of Augustin sleeping in the barn loft and coming to the table for supper. of conversations that started as practical and ended as something else, of Ivy deciding, with the sovereign authority that small children have over such matters, that she liked him and that settled it. On a warm evening in October, with the maples along the fence line going red and gold and Ivy asleep inside, Wren sat on the porch steps with Augustine, and she said, "Thomas used to say that the land doesn't care who you were before you came to it. It only cares what you do with it while you're there." Augustine was quiet for a while, looking at the last of the light on the hills. "He was right," he said. Wren leaned her head against his shoulder, and he sat very still for a moment, as if he wasn't sure he deserved the weight of it. And then his arm came around her, and he held on. There are men who come into a woman's life like a storm, loud and sudden and consuming. And then there are men who come like the change of a season, so gradual you don't notice the shift, until one morning you step outside, and the air is different, and the light has changed, and you realize, standing there, that you are warm. Wren Calloway had survived the storm. What she found on the other side of it was the season she had not known to hope for, and it was enough, and it was real, and it held. I keep thinking about the moment Wren sliced open the back cover of that ledger. She had been carrying it for 3 weeks through rain and mud and fear, and the answer had been there the whole time, pressed flat inside the leather, waiting for someone with steady enough hands and clear enough eyes to find it. That's the part that stays with me. Not the dramatic moments, not the riders coming down the ridge, not the confrontation on the road. The quiet moment of a woman sitting by a fire, finally still enough to think. Wren did something I find genuinely hard to do, and I think most people do too. She kept her moral footing when everything around her was designed to make her doubt it. Creed had a warrant with her name on it. The judge was bought. The sheriff was useless. Every official structure that was supposed to protect her had been turned against her, and she didn't become bitter or reckless or dishonest in response. She kept Thomas's ledger. She kept his truth. She walked toward the one institution she believed still had integrity, the state land office, and she laid the evidence on the counter and said plainly what she needed. That kind of integrity under pressure isn't passive. It's one of the hardest things a person can do. And then there's Augustine. I think about how long he sat with Thomas's letter before Wren ever arrived at his door. 3 months. He had found proof of a murder, and he had held it carefully, and he had thought through what it would take to actually make it matter, not just morally, but practically. The affidavit, the writer sent ahead to Frankfurt, the jurisdictional argument he made on the road, he didn't just want justice, he figured out how justice could actually work, given the specific obstacles in front of him. That's the part I try to remember when I'm facing something complicated. That good intentions aren't enough on their own. You have to think. You have to understand the system you're operating in, even a broken one, and find the lever that actually moves it. But what I come back to most is the endurance of it. Not one dramatic act of courage. 11 days of walking in the rain, 4 bullets in a dead man's notebook. The decision made over and over again in the cold and the dark to keep going. Wren didn't survive because she had a plan. She survived because she refused to stop. That's a different thing. Plans fall apart. The rain doesn't care about your timeline. What keeps you moving when the plan is gone is something harder to name. A refusal to let the worst version of the story be the final one. I think about the causes and the consequences in this story, and they hold up cleanly. Creed's violence came from greed, and it ended in a federal cell. Thomas's carefulness, hiding the map where only someone who truly knew him would think to look, saved his family from beyond his own death. Augustine's decades of isolation came from a wound, and his willingness to finally act came from recognizing the same wound in someone else. Every outcome in the story traces back to a choice someone made, usually a quiet one, usually under pressure. What Wren built in Lexington wasn't just a farm. It was the life Thomas had been trying to build for her, completed by her own hands, on her own terms. That's not luck. That's what happens when a person refuses to let someone else's cruelty write the ending. I find that worth holding on to.